What is the difference between MSP, MSSP, and SOC? We'll have that answer on today's MSP Zone.
You're entering the MSP Zone, a podcast for the managed services community, covering news, analysis, and interviews from around the globe. Elevate your MSP game by staying in the MSP Zone. And now, your host, Charles Weaver.
And it's good to be back at the MSP Zone after a short break. Took a week off to reset and recharge the batteries, and they are fully stocked up. So we are very excited to be back and talking about actually a listener request. This came in from an MSP, and they had a really great question. What is the difference between an MSP, an MSSP, and a SOC, or a SOC as a service provider? And it's something that we hear all three of those terms thrown around, used quite frequently, and I use it myself. But some of you may, it's one of those things where you say something or hear something so frequently, and then you realize, do I really understand what that is? What is the meaning of those phrases? And are you aware of other people using or defining those phrases or terms in different ways than you or I might be accustomed to? And that's always the trick, right? Is making sure that we are conscious of the different uses of these very frequently used terms in the MSP community. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And a lot, just a heads up, a lot of what I'm going to talk about has a lot of different ways that it could be interpreted. So I want to be very clear up front that I'm going to give you my perspective. The perspective is not a one-size-fits-all. It is simply my opinion on each of these different terms and how they commonly, more frequently, at least as I see them, get used or implemented in a real-world managed services environment. That's the context in which I'm going to attempt to define each of these terms, explain how they present themselves out there in the marketplace, and hopefully answer this question for at least one of you out there, but hopefully a number of you out there might also be thinking about or have questions related to this. So let's dive right in. Obviously, what's an MSP? You can't really answer the other two without defining the MSP first, so let's do that. I will take everyone down a memory lane trip down to 2004 to 2005. I'm not sure which year it was, but they had a group of our then board members, and we were in a secluded place in San Diego, if I recall, in a resort, and we were tackling, amongst the many issues we were tackling on that day, specifically, one was, how do we as an industry profession define ourselves? And the conversation, and eventually the question was posed, well, what is an MSP? And what are managed services? And that consumed many hours of conversation because, unlike today, we have a lot better idea of what we define those terms as, and we have a lot more history and usage now to look back on, which makes things easier. But in 2004, believe me, it was a different time. Even though managed services have been around for maybe a decade at that point, it still was kind of, if fringe is too extreme a word, then it was certainly not as popular as it is today. But nevertheless, we did come up with a rather elegant solution, which I think is still something that I use today as my definition of managed services, or MSP, and helps me a lot, especially when defining an MSP compared to non-MSPs. Well, what is a non-MSP, you might ask? Well, that's, specifically and more frequently, that's a break-fix company. It's a company that is not proactive. They're reactive. They have, they're not always, but often they have VAR characteristics, right? Meaning they are value-added resellers or come from that market and are attempting or have attempted to put in place a managed services offering. But an MSP is a proactive provider of IT services on an outsourced basis. That's the real trick. That's the key, right? Two of them really: proactive and the outsourced one-to-many business relationship. Because you could be proactive on a one-to-one basis, right? You could have one customer and be very proactive, but that really isn't an MSP, right? That's something different. An MSP and the strengths of an MSP and the value that an MSP provides to a customer is the fact that by delivering its services in a proactive manner, the MSP can do so to many customers at scale and with great efficiency. And the efficiencies that the MSP brings to that relationship make it valuable to the customer, because the customer otherwise would be buying one-to-one, essentially, non-scalable, non-economically viable IT services, which is very similar to what an IT shop, an internal IT department, does. Right? IT departments can be scalable, but this is a brain twister for those of you. They are almost always inefficient in their practice, unless they are of the type where they are delivering and operating similar to an MSP on that one-to-many basis, delivering their IT services proactively, because you can still have a very reactive internal IT department. Oh, yes, you can. So don't just think because you have an internal IT department that you are somehow, forward-thinking. You are proactive in your monitoring and management of your IT assets. You might be, but it doesn't necessarily make it so. Just because you've got people full-time dedicated on an IT job, there are many ways that you could be not doing what you need to be doing, and it has nothing to do with fault or ignorance or anything like that. It could just simply be budget. It could be you don't have enough people to do what you need to do. You don't have enough tools. You don't have the people with the knowledge to use those tools if you happen to have the tools, right? And on and on and on. The process, obviously, is part of that as well. And so that's what an MSP is they deliver in a proactive fashion. They do not wait for the problem to present itself, react to the problem, and then bill accordingly for the resolution of that problem. We are not in that business as MSPs. We are in the business of anticipating problems, actively managing IT assets, environments, systems, networks, applications, whatever it is that you're managing. And you do so in a way that attempts to reduce, not to zero, because it'll never get to that point, but to reduce to as small a unit of measurement as possible the amount of disruptive events that you have going on within that monitored or managed object. And the efficiencies, as I mentioned before, that associate themselves with that business model, the access to the tools, the access to the people, the access to a process that is capable of being repeated over and over and over again at scale, offers a consumer of that service a great deal of benefit at a price that they would otherwise not be able to afford. That, to me, is a very prototypical description of an MSP. You disagree, you have some other elements, certainly, you're free to have that belief. If I had more time, I would probably add some additional elements, but that's a very good baseline definition of an MSP. Now let's talk about what an MSSP is. If we just defined managed service provider, then to the typical person, an MSSP, at least today, would more likely than not be defined as a managed security service provider. For those of you who are saying, is that the only thing that MSSP could stand for? Absolutely not. I have heard managed storage service providers, I don't want to go into the list, but there's a lot of different things that MSSP could be used for, but security certainly today is the most predominant use case of the acronym MSSP. Is an MSSP different from an MSP? Perhaps, but maybe not. In the early days of managed services, the MSPs that I interviewed and talked to a lot, there certainly were the mainstream general practitioners who, while they were certainly covering, meaning monitoring and managing IT network objects like firewalls, and those weren't the only security-related objects or services that being delivered, but that was certainly the most specifically, outwardly visible object that an MSP might have on their sales literature and their website saying, do you manage firewalls? The vast majority of MSPs, since the beginning of MSPs, have managed firewalls as a regular ongoing part of their business practice. And pretty soon that list began to expand, and it wasn't just firewalls that they would manage, but they would also start selling, deploying, and managing antivirus, technologies to the downstream customers, to the desktops, to the laptops, to the servers. And then, anti-spyware got added to the mix, maybe in the early to mid 2000s. And then you had, from there, gradually many other incremental technologies that were pretty much security specific, began to be deployed and began to be commercially available to the MSP industry and predominantly sold through the MSPs to their customers. A textbook definition of what an MSSP does, I suppose, might look like this or sound like this, and that is an MSSP has as a predominant, part of its managed services offering surrounds security, right? I think that would be a fairly easy, not debatable, but no one's going to get ruffled with that type of a definition. That the MSSP really is a specialist, right? It doesn't mean that they don't do other things, but they at least have some amount of specialty in and around security. Now, maybe they do that for a particular application, set of applications. Maybe they do that for a particular type of technology. Like you have MSPs who were and still are, really just they're focused on firewall, IDS, IPS, and other related security offerings. We'll talk about SOC as a service shortly. And those certainly would be defined quite easily and nicely as an MSSP. Does it mean that the earlier defined MSP can't or doesn't offer security? Not at all. In fact, I think it's a tremendous point of confusion and a disservice to say that an MSP doesn't offer security, right? Because there's a lot of companies, providers out there who deliver great managed security, but they don't define themselves as an MSSP for a variety of reasons. If you are looking out there, if you're an analyst, if you're a vendor, you sell to MSPs, if you're a customer and you're looking for an MSP, pay attention to this. What I'm saying is that you cannot always judge by what's on a website if you're talking to an MSP who also happens to offer security. If you're talking to on the website something that says, we are an MSSP, I would really hope that they are competent and are delivering good managed security service offerings. You would assume that, you would hope that, right? If they say that. But that's a chief distinction, right? Is the focus and the attention on security that defines what an MSSP is compared to what an MSP does. Again, it doesn't mean that the MSP doesn't offer security. In fact, most MSPs that I am aware of who call themselves MSPs do offer security. It doesn't mean that they don't do it well. It doesn't mean that they don't have competency in it. It doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of customers who purchase that service from them. It just may mean, for whatever reason, that they haven't chosen to define themselves exclusively as an MSSP. And there's nothing wrong with that. So I hope that makes sense to people out there, is that just because you use MSSP or MSP, it is not necessarily, you need to ask more questions, is what I'm saying. And one of those questions that I might be asking an MSP or an MSSP is, do you have a network and or a security operations center? And if I was asking an MSP, and I'm putting myself in the shoes of let's say a customer, one of the things that I would ask are, all right, I am aware that that network operation centers and security operation centers can and often are come in a variety of flavors, and two of those flavors might look like either an in-person traditional NOC or what might be called today a virtual NOC or a virtual SOC. And those are legitimate questions, and I think if you're an MSP, you need to be prepared to answer those questions, pretty quickly, right? Because that's not the type of thing where you want to say, I'm not sure. All right, if you have sales or marketing people and they say, I don't know if we have a physical or a virtual NOC, they're not doing you any favors, believe me. So you need to answer and be ready to answer the question of, do you have a virtual NOC? Do you have a physical NOC? I use the term NOC and SOC interchangeably. They are technically very specific and can be different, but they can also be the same. So a network operations center came from the old telecom days, right? Where you had a physical room where you had physical defined boundaries of who had access to this room. And inside that room, you had physical connectivity, power, and other elements that allowed for that room and the people in that room to be protected against business disruptive events, power outages, connectivity outages, so that they could look at and see across the board all the many customers that they service and determine, is anyone having problems, outages, downtime, servers gone offline, things not responding, those types of things, and respond to them in an efficient, scalable, proactive, remember that from before, proactive manner. And that's what a NOC does. And the SOC, Security Operations Center, does the same thing applied towards security. Now, what a SOC might lead some of us to think about is not just monitoring network traffic, not just monitoring the uptime, downtime status of a object, but it could specifically be focused at security objects like firewalls, IDS, IPS devices. It could be looking at log traffic of a firewall or of other network devices. It could be looking for anomalies. It could be looking for IP address, anomalies that fall outside of the normal IP ranges that typically associate themselves with the network in question, right? Very common tactic, by the way. Whatever it is, a SOC, whether it's virtual or physical, is something that every MSP ought to have. And my assumption is every MSP has a NOC or a SOC. But not every MSP has a SOC. Every MSP has a NOC. Whether it's virtual or physical is the question. If you don't have a physical place, like if you're 100% remote, as a lot of MSPs were back last year, then you had at that point a virtual NOC. Now it doesn't mean, and this is kind of getting off topic, but the NOC definition of virtual and physical really gets down to a couple of characteristic questions. Where are the people and where are the systems? Meaning, where are the applications that the NOC or SOC personnel use, right? So in the traditional telecom model that I referred to earlier, those systems would have been hosted right there in that building. Those network monitoring tools would have been right there, almost literally alongside the NOC personnel, so that those systems had the same uptime and business operational capabilities as the people did. Today, now, we have disassociated with a lot of MSPs, is they don't, for a variety of really good reasons, by the way, have separated the people from the systems, meaning that it's no longer, for the majority of MSPs, especially smaller MSPs, who don't want to take on the liability of physically and virtually securing those network monitoring management tools that they rely on so much. They put those elsewhere. They put them into the cloud. They put them into a co-location facility. They put them someplace other than where the physical people are who use them. And that still would be kind of a virtual or a hybrid NOC model, and very typical, very common. It's not, there are different styles of NOC and SOC configurations. But the question that was posed for today's episode is, now that we've defined NOC, SOC, virtual NOC, physical NOC, and all those things, what is SOC as a service? Well, as the name might suggest, the SOC as a service is the delivery of a security operations center set of products that are delivered on a one-to-many basis, predominantly but not exclusively to MSPs who don't otherwise have access to those types of, typically 24/7 eyes on, log analysis, monitoring, and management of security-related data. Now, a brief comment about outsourced SOC. Just like in the mid-2000s, we had a fairly significant channel debate about whether or not an MSP ought to develop their own NOC or outsource. It is my interpretation and position that while you have some really good outsourced SOC companies out there, meaning MSPs, right? And that's where this gets even more confusing, is that you have a lot of SOC as a service companies who say, yeah, we're a SOC as a service. Well, I would still call them an MSP. And that could get really confusing, because even though they define themselves as SOC as a service, predominantly so they can capture the attention of the MSPs that they want to sell to, they should still be, and they typically are, still delivering managed services, but they're just delivering it to MSPs instead of to the end users. And the managed services they offer are typically around the security monitoring management. If you want to define it as a SIM, like a security incident event management or monitoring service as a service, that would probably be accurate and appropriate. But these SOC as a service companies typically, I think they define themselves as a SOC as a service provider, chiefly so that they can define themselves as a channel vendor, as compared to an MSP who would define themselves as such to a customer. So it's not that they're not an MSP. They are in many ways. It's just who they sell to is what distinguishes whether they call themselves an MSP, MSSP, or a SOC as a service provider. Now, that's a very baseline definition of all three of those terms, and there are always exceptions to the rule. But I think that should help most of you out there. Again, whether you're an end user, whether you're an MSP, And you could be an MSP that sells managed services to end user customers, and you could also have a SOC as a service program. I've seen those MSPs out there. It just depends on who you sell to and your focus and speciality as it relates to security services. Now, if you are a SOC as a service provider, I would hope that at the very least, you have some physical and logical security characteristics at work. I'm not going to say that every SOC as a service provider ought to have a physical NOC, but I've seen a lot of them, and I don't see a lot of virtual security as a service or security operations center as a service shops out there. It's just not the type of thing that if you want to do well in that business line, that you want to have a bunch of people working from home remotely. It doesn't lend itself to that. Furthermore, if you're in the SOC as a service business, having that physical place, at least for the people, right? We talked about having the systems could be housed and hosted virtually elsewhere. But the people at least should be together to some degree so that they can benefit from the collective problem solving and wisdom sharing that commonly associates itself with a NOC or a SOC environment. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the early MSPs and telcos did it that way, is because not just because virtual work and remote work was more challenging back then, but it was because there was such a tremendous benefit to having the shared collective wisdom and experience of being able to turn to the person to your left or your right and say, hey, I've got this problem. How did you fix it? And that type of information sharing just doesn't really exist, in the same way with the same ease as it does in a physical environment. The SOC as a service community also, needs, and I would be very careful here, they need to be people who actually own some IP themselves, meaning what they can't be is a reseller of another vendor's SIM as a service or SOC as a service, reselling it to a bunch of MSPs. And if you think, oh my gosh, who would do that? Guess what? I've seen it before, and it does exist. It doesn't happen a lot, but there are some people out there who present themselves as a SOC as a service, but they really are not the ones delivering the service. It's somebody else, and they're white labeling it. And that would be another question that I would ask a SOC as a service provider is, do you deliver these services? Is it really you, or are you white labeling it for somebody else? If so, who is that person? These are all very legitimate, very appropriate questions that you should ask. So we've defined an MSP. We've defined what an MSSP is, and we've defined the scenarios where you might identify a SOC as a service, an outsourced SOC, also known as an MSP. They could all be variations of an MSP, or they could be very specific and just focused on, like I said, a 100% channel play, in which case they most likely sometimes won't use the term MSP just to avoid confusion because that's who they're selling to. But the attributes, I hope, are now a little bit more clear to you after that kind of brief discussion, brief defining of those terms. And again, if you have different opinions, feel free to share them. I mean, like I said, I'm always open to hearing other people's opinions on this, but those are my kind of reflections on how I've seen the term MSP, MSSP, and SOC or SOC as a service used. I hope that helped. Thanks to the listener who wrote in for that one, and keep them coming. That's a great question to ask. And if you have a question you would like addressed on the MSP Zone, send us an email at mspzone@mspalliance.com. We will get to your requests as often and as frequently as we can. And until next time, this is Charles Weaver with the MSP Zone.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a like. Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast so you will get notified when future episodes are released. We will see you next time in the MSP Zone.